Okay, welcome friends to part 2 of our workshop on taking back your story. I am Bryn. Lovely to see you. If you haven't watched the first part, I encourage you to go back and watch because it will make more sense if you do. So, what are we talking about now? We are talking about our early stories. So that means the stories that we learn from others, from our early childhood and how they impact how we experience the world. Now, you maybe have already learned some of these things, but sometimes we need to hear them again. Sometimes we're not in the place that it makes sense. The other thing is that I encourage you, if you have heard them already, to maybe expand your curiosity. We can always learn more and grow a little bit more, but it's always nice to have a refresher. So, as I go into this, I'm going to try to use inclusive language, so I might not always say like parents or family. I might also say like childhood community, because I want to make this as applicable to as many of us as possible. And I understand that we all have very different kind of upbringings, and what childhood looks like looks very different for all of us. So let's get into it. Nature versus nurture. I'm sure you have heard that before. Basically, the question of nature versus nurture is, why are we the way we are? So is it biology? Is it our genetics that makes us who we are? Or is it nurture? Is it like how we are raised, what our early life looks like? And I think a lot of us understand, especially in psychology, that it is both. I think as we get older, we also start to recognize that these things that we thought maybe were black and white are very much more like somewhere in the middle, and that's the same with nature and nurture. It tends to be that, yes, you have these genetics that have created certain aspects of who you are, but then the way that we are raised will also change how those things seem to us, how they show themselves, and how we experience them. So let's get into it. Our personalities are stitched together a lot in our early kind of years, and that can be 0 to 15, it can be 0 to 7, but we do start getting these things stitched into us even at a very, very young age. Just so you know, I haven't read it, but I know that Oprah and a psychologist just came out with a book about this kind of thing. So if you're ending up feeling curious and you want to learn more about this, I have no idea what it's called, to be honest, but just search Oprah and it'll be there, I'm sure. But basically, in those years, we are starting to show our natural attributes of our personality that might be from genetics, and it might also be from the feedback we're getting from other people. But some of those parts of us are going to be there no matter what, even if they're not supported, even if they're denied, even if they're completely encouraged. They're just like who we are going to be, right? But how we are in taking the feedback that we get will impact how we experience some of those things. So it will impact our beliefs about ourselves, our beliefs about the world, and about others. One of the other things that I want to quickly mention is our biases. Not just our biases in ourselves, about ourselves, but as we start getting these feedback from family members or community members or just culture in general, we will start inputting this into our morality in the world as well. So some of these things are harmful to ourselves and some of them are harmful to others. So I encourage you to do some consciousness raising around some of the biases that might have been implicit or explicit in our lives. Basically, just so you know, explicit means what is said to us, what we are told directly, and implicit is like what we pick up on through other information. I kind of think of it as like explicit is talking the talk, and implicit is walking the walk. So while we are forming our understanding of the world and how we fit into it, parts of our natural personality end up being praised, encouraged, or discouraged. The world that is influencing our small little brains can feel really big and feel really black and white. So what I mean by that is whoever is raising us, whether that's a community or a nuclear family or whatever it looks like, to us, that is how big the world is. as a child, you are very much unaware of like how large the world is, right? So all you are kind of gaining is you're building your understanding of the world through the lens of like, this is what the world is, right? And so it's really important. Not every kid and most kids can't really understand nuance, but it's important to share more than just your corner of the world to a child so that they start getting more empathic, they're more understanding, they have a better grasp on the differences between people and how differences aren't a problem. So another thing is very important. The people who are influencing us may have no idea how they are influencing us. They might not understand their impact on us. So that could be, like I said, that community, even of kid friends that you start having. It could be parents of your friends. It could be the faith community or the cultural community that you're a part of. It could just be like culture in general. So one of the things that I am passionate about, as well as someone who loves TV and media, is representation. So yes, a lot of kids shows are like cartoons, so who knows what they're trying to represent, but I encourage us to try to share learning of like books or music or media with children that is not just from your corner of the world. So again, they start becoming more compassionate, more curious, more understanding, and just whole, right? The cool thing about that too is like you might relate to someone in a way that you never expected to relate to someone. And if we just keep our little corners of the world really insulated, we're going to have very black and white ideas of what is right and wrong. So imagine yourself as a child, about like 5, let's say, even younger maybe, where even like small things seem really big. So an example of this is like, do you wonder why some adults are afraid of birds? And now, I'm not shaming you if you actually have a phobia of a bird, and I'm not saying that this is the reason that you have a phobia, but just this is my example, so please bear with me. So as a child around like 4 or 5, you're what, like yay high? No, I'm kidding, you're much taller than that, but you're still small. And so to you, a crow coming over and like stealing your fry could be very frightening. You do not feel the sense of like, I could protect myself against this crow, because the crow is probably close to your size. It's just this thing that swoops out of nowhere, and what you start inputting into a neutral thing, the neutral thing is the crow, that is just a thing. What you start inputting is your beliefs and experiences onto that neutral thing. So as a child, you say, that is really scary, that thing is unpredictable, it might kill me, oh my word, right? So that can keep in our little brains as we grow and grow and grow. Even if, as we're older, our prefrontal cortex, which is this part of our brain that understands, more rational logic, even as that part of our brain still is growing and understands, okay, I don't need to be afraid of a crow. That can get inputted, I don't know, is that a word, guys? Into our brains and as a child, and can end up becoming what our belief is around that thing. Does that make sense? Okay, so we are learning what we need to do, how we need to be, how we need to act in order to receive safety, belonging, love, basically like our survival needs. We are thinking that when we are praised for something, that means we are safer, right? We are going to be protected. That is what praise sometimes tells us. If we are reprimanded, we are thinking we are rejected, we are no longer safe. So what parenting we want to do, I'm not a parent, but as we know, like structure and boundaries are very important for children, as well as compassionate, right? So we want to infuse that. And so as you're growing up as a child, you're starting to input, okay, this personality trait of mine is praised, so I'm going to keep doing that. So an example of this is, say you are a laid back baby. How often have you heard that when you're around adults who've just had a baby, where they're like, oh, they're so good, they're so calm, right? Which is good. And being laid back is a lovely personality trait, but it's neutral, right? It's just a personality trait. But what ends up happening is, if you keep getting feedback that it's positive and good to be laid back, you will start attaching that neutral personality trait to your value. And so what ends up happening is that personality trait gets inflated for you. And if someone rejects you or says you're not laid back enough, or you act in a way that is not laid back, because we are multifaceted beings that have lots of different personality traits, we end up feeling like, is my value diminished? I'm scared. This is frightening. I'm worried I'm not going to get love, and that can go into our adulthood. So we all have these personality traits, but how they are kind of responded to might impact how big and important they feel in our lives. So as a child, it ends up being attached to like, this is my survival. So like being laid back means that I survive. Having good grades or being the smart one means that I survive, right? And I know as an adult, you're like, oh, that's not how I experience it now. I know that I'll survive even if I'm not smart. But there's like a little part of us that's still alive in us that does believe that. And so we need to try to heal that part of us. So another piece. Maybe you had emotions or behaviors that were encouraged not to experience. You were told, like, don't do that. So that could be anger. I know a lot of women were socialized not to express anger, that it was like a masculine trait. And then you also hear the other side where it's like, boys will be boys. And then there's sadness. There is even like joy you might have been told not to feel, or if you're afraid of something, you might have been told like, oh, it's not scary, and kind of downplayed. So you're starting to pick up on information and form beliefs about those feelings, about your experience, and you're starting to attach maybe higher anxiety or shame to some of those things. So it's your sense of what is valued in the world and how you create belonging when you start getting that feedback. Does that make sense? So an example is, maybe you were like that happy but loud kid in school, and you were told so often to be quiet, or you were like disrupting, and all of these like negative stories about this personality trait start getting fed into you. And so that creates a deeper sense of shame that maybe feels like I have to like distance myself from this. And yet sometimes we also are like the loud kid because we want the attention. We need to feel seen and heard and loved. And so it kind of becomes this war with ourselves that we either feel like shame, or, you know, we feel like we have to distance ourselves from that. Also, something I have seen as a therapist is feeling sad as a kid so often gets tied to, are you hungry or are you tired? Which is true, it's fair, it happens. But if it's constantly not understood, if you don't feel like you are seen and sat with, even if your sadness has something to do with needing a nap, you will start thinking that like the only reason I'm sad is because I'm tired. And I have literally seen people just like tune out or shut down because they feel like their sadness is not something they are comfortable experiencing, because they were never taught how to experience it. They were taught to just go to sleep every time they were sad. And so what we want to do is start to learn how to sit in the discomfort of some of the emotions that maybe haven't been expressed in how we're supposed to experience them. That wasn't making sense. Basically, we need to learn how to sit in uncomfortable emotions. Okay, so your turn. The last piece that I want to say is when I go back to that bias thing. So maybe for you, again, as we are taught what is good and what is bad, we start also putting that in black and white terms onto other people. So we start reaching it beyond ourselves and saying, like, not only is me being loud a bad thing, also like loud people are bad in a way, right? Which I know sounds, again, very extreme, but that's what ends up happening. So I want you to consider any of like the coded language that might have been taught to you. And again, some of those explicit and implicit things. And I will get into that a little bit more. But an explicit thing might have been that your parents taught you to respect all people, but then the implicit thing is what you picked up on their body language, or you overheard them talking about someone or a group of people, and that starts contradicting itself, and it's very confusing. And so you get these ingrained implicit biases that you're not even aware of, because explicitly you're like, oh, I was never taught that, but you were. It was just through action and felt experience. Now, I am not an anti-racism teacher. I am a cisgendered white woman, and so I do not feel I am the appropriate person to profit off of that. But if this part of the conversation is interesting to you, I encourage you to do a little bit of research and find some anti-racism teachers that you can learn from. I did a beautiful course at a school, college nearby called UBC, about anti-racism in the workplace, and that was very interesting, and I'm so grateful for my teacher. There's also things online like anti-racism. There's a podcast called like Anti-Racism Podcast, I believe. There's the Anti-Racism newsletter, there's Check Your Privilege, there's Let Me Educate You, there's lots of different people. So that's not what I'm here for, but if that is something that is of interest to you, I encourage you to go check it out. So let's quickly do these questions, and then we will go on to our next section. So what are some of the traits that you remember being praised for or being told to tone down? So I definitely was praised for being like likable, I guess. And so what that has done for me is get very attached to my value. And that's not anything that my family or my community was trying to teach me. They weren't trying to say like you are only valuable if you are likable, but that gets very attached. So I found that like my superpower is like trying to meet people where they're at, like I'm doing now. But what happens if someone doesn't like me or if I feel rejected? I can take it really personally. It can feel like I have lost a sense of value. And now as I'm older, I know that is not true. And I think as we continue to learn how to like love ourselves and try to be our most authentic self, we just recognize like, you know what? I'm not every person's kind of person, and that's okay. I can still respect and understand you, but we do not have to be friends, and you do not have to like me. And what you think of me does not have to mean that I take that on. So the question is, what traits have you been praised for? What traits were you discouraged for? And how do you think this has shaped your view of belonging, safety, acceptance, value, and love now? Okay, next question. What are some of the explicit and sorry. What are some of the explicit and implicit rules and stories that you may have been taught? This is like a kind of fun one. It's hard to brainstorm, but it's always an interesting one to kind of unpack. So an explicit rule is like your curfew or not putting your feet up on the table. The implicit rule is maybe what that was trying to communicate to you. So whatever that might be, like manners, I guess, or safety, I guess, right? Like curfew could be connected to safety. And your role in your family, things like that. But the implicit could also be things that you just picked up on, like it was never told to you, but you knew not to do it. So then what is an explicit or implicit story? Stories, I also think of like generational trauma and generational stories. So there's this fun thing that we do in therapy, which is like a family tree to kind of explore what some of the patterns in your family might be, including personality traits and things like that. So if you're curious about it, let me know. We can do one together. But an implicit or explicit story that we are taught is more of like a theme, right? So perhaps we come from a long line of like high achievers or something. And so what we are implicitly taught is like, to have value, I need to be a high achiever. Say we come from a family full of doctors, we're like, I need to be a doctor. Like, that is what I need to do. Maybe no one told you that completely. It wasn't a rule. It wasn't like anything like that, but you're just like, oh, this is our story. This is what we do here. And that also happens very culturally as well. So whether you're part of a faith community or a cultural community, some of those stories as well very much impact us. So I encourage you to jot down some of those things and brainstorm what comes to mind. And the next part of this, we will talk about the stories that we start to write for ourselves. So thanks for joining, and I'll see you soon.